What if there was a world where spiritual entities existed in quasi-physical form, interacting with physical reality in a mostly psychic capacity, after having passed through higher dimensional, astral archetypes of each of the planets in the solar system? What if there were countless dangerous animals in this world, the size of dinosaurs that occasionally attacked and slaughtered settlements and towns, or trans-medium vehicles that could fly through the air, in the seas, and out into space to the nearest planet? What if in this world there was a technological advancement of nuclear fusion that created abundance but fell into the wrong hands and misfired, destroying or splitting entire continents and all but resetting civilization in a volcanic fury? What if in this world, at the height of its civilization, the spiritual knowledge and history of the world was perverted for selfish purposes, used for the gains of territory, dominance, and enslavement by the sons of Belial, who turned to the black arts and, in so doing, created a chain of effects that finally destroyed the last remnant of this advanced society? And what if this world were not a matter of fiction at all, but the same Earth that is our home? And what if this civilization that endured a first, second, and finally third cataclysmic period was the civilization that fills the gap in prehistory and explains everything from the pyramids in Central America and Egypt to the foundational spiritual traditions that spread from Mongolia to Peru, from the Yucatan to the Mediterranean? What if Plato's Atlantis, written of as a seafaring empire existing up until around 9600 BC, remembered by and cryptically concealed in ancient Egypt, was not an allegory at all, but an echo of lost history, a fragment of a greater truth that, if proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of human civilization? This is the story of Edgar Cayce's Atlantis. Whether or not we could or should ever be convinced of it is not the point of this essay. Instead, we merely hope to express Cayce's story of Atlantis, which is used here as a broad term, encompassing tens of thousands of years of lost human history, when the world often looked radically different than it does today, and the Atlantic Ocean, mainly the waters off the east coast of the United States, including the Bermuda Triangle, the Sargasso Sea, and the Bahamas, were the major homes of the islands and the continent of an advanced and diverse people, indeed the ancestors of modern humans, who over long periods of political change and technological or natural volcanic upheaval spread across the world to leave traces of megalithic structures, mythologies, and spiritual teachings that still live in and with us till this day. On a sunny afternoon in 1890, a 13-year-old boy from Kentucky named Edgar Cayce looked up from his Bible to find a woman standing in the woods before him. Quote, "Your prayers have been answered," she said in a soft and musical voice. "Tell me what you would like most of all, so that I may give it to you." At her back there were the shapes of wings, and young Cayce hesitated before finally saying, "Most of all, I would like to be helpful to others, and especially to children when they are sick." Then the woman disappeared, leaving young Cayce in a rush back home where he told his mother about the vision. At this stage, Cayce struggled to spell and complete his lessons, and his father demanded strict correction. The lady's voice, the same as he had seen in the woods, came to him again, saying, "If you can sleep a little, we can help you." Soon Cayce fell asleep on the book and was woken up to his father pulling it away. But now Cayce challenged his father to test him on anything in the book, eventually flipping to pages at random and having Cayce recite the photographs and words within, as if he had memorized the entire book in a sitting. This extraordinary experience led to Cayce bringing home books on a wide range of subjects, sleeping with them beneath his pillow, and waking up knowing their full contents. Soon Cayce, who would forever remain a devout Christian, will have quit high school and read the Bible from cover to cover a reported 18 times, a feat he would perform at least once a year for every year of his life. He met a popular evangelist who helped him make sense of his visions, and young Cayce had ambitions of becoming a minister or a missionary, wielding nothing but his Bible. In 1897, he became engaged to Gertrude Evans, who would remain his dear wife and vital partner for the rest of his years. Cayce worked in bookstores and insurance, but in 1900 he was beset by a paralysis of the vocal cords and could do little more than whisper. The next year, a hypnotist puts Cayce under hypnosis, and suddenly he's able to speak normally. Under this state of hypnosis, Cayce is able to diagnose his own ailment and treat himself, recovering his ability to speak. This led to the first of what became known as his readings, where Cayce would lie down, enter a state of trance wherein a patient or conductor would pose questions, which Cayce answered vocally. In this state, Cayce not only had communication with spiritual entities, but his sources of information are generally known to be the unconscious minds of the patients in question, or the universal consciousness, akin to the Akashic records. Essentially, every individual soul has an informational imprint on an ethereal database, which Cayce could access, but not always in totality. Through the connection with the immanent and all-pervading universal consciousness, information became available that was otherwise inaccessible. The repeated demonstration of his readings' accuracy and their magnificent results would eventually lead to the establishment of the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach in 1931, still open to this day, where it rests on high ground with an expansive view of the Atlantic Ocean. For 40 years, Edgar Cayce gave readings on over 10,000 subjects, treating illnesses, offering spiritual, personal, and business advice, and giving crucial and controversial information related to spiritual reality, including karma, reincarnation, true astrology, the nature of God and angels, the secret history of Jesus, and much more. He is by far the most documented psychic in history, but among his over 14,000 readings, he gave about 1,200 on Egypt, and a much smaller number on more ancient civilization, and on Atlantis, a technologically and spiritually advanced civilization spanning many thousands of years and stretching from what is today the Gulf of Mexico to the Straits of Gibraltar. Human beings in the Edgar Cayce readings do not follow anything close to the current model of anthropology, or any history taught by the world's institutions. Rather, humans in one form or another have a history that goes back not thousands of years, but millions. Exact chronological order is a challenge in the Cayce readings, as they were most often for individuals and included influences and details from past lives, containing details about Atlantis and ancient history in rather small passages in relation to a personal past life reading, rarely with an emphasis on chronological precision. With this in mind, let us first sketch over some of the early details of Atlantean history, covering the periods over 50,000 years ago, prior to the first geological upheaval. In the first place, the entrance of the soul into the human body did not take place as described in modern science or in the Bible, or other well-known religious texts, but rather these mythologies merely hint at the true story. In the Cayce material, the first beings that became something like the humans we are today existed as thought forms or non-physical entities that underwent gradual processes of densification, whereupon their vibration would begin to resonate at levels closer and closer to that of the physical plane, until by continual interaction, the first manifestations of bodies or encasements were formed, and these at times becoming abominations to one extreme or retaining a kind of angelic purity at the other. There is then a baffling diversity of beings in the early history of the world, ranging from dwarves to giants, from godlike entities, theriomorphic sentients, to those more naturally evolved hominids, who served for long periods as a slave class. There was a point where these thought beings were androgynous, and it was an entity who Cayce provides as an early incarnation of Jesus, named Emilius, who first noted, quote, the separations of the beings who inhabited that portion of the Earth's sphere into male and female as separate entities or individuals. As to their forms in the physical sense, these were much rather of the nature of thought forms, or able to push out of themselves in that direction in which their development took shape in thought, much in the way and manner as the amoeba would in the waters of a stagnant bay or lake in the present. These thought beings gradually materialized with each decision that gratified their desire or built upon the material conditions. These beings took on qualities of the environment they pressed into, which became the early racial type of the being. In the Cayce material, human beings exist across 5 racial types: the red, white, yellow, brown, and black. Races that did not evolve out of a single geographic source like Africa, but came into being simultaneously in different parts of the world. This stretches back quite far into prehistory, but it becomes important to notice these distant threads when it comes time for Atlantis proper and modern civilization. That is because, according to the Cayce readings, the same souls who endured the cycles of Atlantean advancement and destruction, and were introduced into both the extremes of technological achievement and violent spiritual perversion, are choosing specifically this modern time to reincarnate due to its similarity with the final period prior to the Atlantean destruction. As well, these old souls are choosing to return as guides to the humans living in this time. The souls that lived in Atlantis and observed or participated in the mistakes of the ruling classes that brought about catastrophe are once again living in an empire that dominates the Atlantic and experiments with technology hidden from the public. And once more is humanity playing out the cycle in order to finally usher in an age of peace, if it can. Let us establish some of the basics when it comes to Cayce's Atlantis. The term Atlantis itself is a generality that comprises a long period of time and at least 3 destructions. Though it does have original etymological roots from the Atlantean times that strengthen its usage in the present day, the term is also a stand-in for the peoples and their successors who at one point occupied landmasses and islands in the Atlantic, gradually spreading into Egypt and the Yucatan, and achieved at one point the highest civilization ever known on Earth. Cayce's readings point out that evidence of this civilization can be discovered, not just in the early pyramid builders, but in the findings of remains of giants and other bizarre skeletons, quite plainly telling us a different version of history. In one place, Cayce predicts the finding of the Bimini Road, discovered in 1968, and suggests this as an example of Atlantean remains. In the beginning, a great portion of human beings used the natural world around them for their needs, and coexisted in harmony with it, and peace was the default state among the people, who had not yet divided into strife and selfish destruction. But there were developments in technology that created an aerial age, an electrical age where chemical, electrical, and nuclear knowledge developed to the point that the understanding of how to travel to other places in the universe was reached. Cayce speaks of the destructive power of atomic energy, of fission at a time when this power was not publicly known or available. In any case, with the development of these powers, coexisting while some beings were still quasi-physical, and others more physically reminiscent of the modern human, certain sons of the creative force, as Cayce calls them, were introduced to profound feelings of lust for the daughters of men. Quote, with these changes that came in as personalities, we find these as the sons of the creative force, as manifest in their experience, looking upon those changed forms, or the daughters of men, and there crept in those pollutions of polluting themselves with those mixtures that brought contempt, hatred, bloodshed, and those that build for desires of self without respects of others' freedom, others' wishes. And there began then in the latter portion of this period of development that brought about those of dissenting and divisions among the peoples in the lands, with the attempts of those still in power, through those lineages of the pure that had kept themselves intact as of the abilities of forces as were manifest in their activities. These built rather those things that attempted to draw back those peoples, through first the various changes or seasons that came about, and in the latter portion of the experience of Emilius was the first establishing of the altars upon which the sacrifices of the field and the forest, and those that were of that satisfied the desires of the physical body, were built. This is the first division among nations and intentions, the ultimate primordial separation between what became known as the sons of the law of one, the beings of light, and those sons of Belial, or Baal, or Balalal, or beings who act for purely selfish purposes and create intense momentum of the negative energies through a sequence of separative decisions, abuses, and perversions. In the book of Enoch, these would be known as the fallen angels, who descended with Simyaza and Azazel, and instructed mankind in the use of weapons and vanities. This created such a negative feedback loop that it became necessary to establish the first accoutrements of religion, worship, and sacrifice. Then we find the natural order turning against the humans, quote, in that period, when there were the invasions of this continent by those of the animal kingdoms, that brought about that meeting of the nations of the globe to prepare a way and manner of disposing of, else they be disposed of themselves by these forces. This solution to the animal and beast threat came in the form of explosives, whose destructive forces caused the first forms of human sacrifices to occur. Quote, with the continued disregard of those that were keeping the pure race and the pure peoples, of those that were to bring all these laws as applicable to the sons of God, man brought in the destructive forces, as used for the peoples that were to be the rule, that combined with those natural resources of the gases of the electrical forces, made in nature and natural form the first of the eruptions that awoke from the depth of the slow-cooling earth, and that portion now near what would be termed the Sargasso Sea, first went into the depths. The result of this great destruction left many islands and the struggling remnant of an empire. Cities were built or rebuilt, and the embodiment of consciousness increased. The natural psychic powers of mankind turned dormant in many, while there remained a certain few who retained these capacities. And in 10,700 BC, we begin to see the final destructive phase, the memory of which was kept sacred and brought into Egypt, in one example by Hermes the Atlantean. Cayce makes the point that those who are interested and curious about Atlantis in the modern world demonstrate immediately by this curiosity some relationship to Atlantis, most likely being the incarnations they experienced then. In the same breath, a soul's innate interest in esoteric and spiritual matters is likewise a tell of their carrying over much of this influence from other incarnations, and can be indicative of a greater degree of spiritual remembering. And it is spiritual remembering that constituted the major effort of the entity Emilius or Adam, who are at times one and the same, or incarnations of the same entity that eventually became Jesus, Melchizedek, Hermes, and others. To paint a broad picture of the situation, there was at a time in Atlantis an innate understanding of one's spiritual place in the universe. The periods of perversion, however, became extreme, and the sons of Belial inverted their most esoteric and spiritual aspects in order to benefit themselves, to dominate a certain so-called lesser and more animalistic-looking race of beings, taking what was once used for travel and defense for imperial domination, military expansion, and, more perversely, sexual and material gratification. In this manner, there is no moral ambiguity or absence of karmic consequence to the Atlantean story. Rather, the destructions and perversions the cult of Baal's black magicians manifested, not in a sustained civilization beneficial to the masses, but periods of radical destruction. This threat necessitated a more measured response from what we might deem the initial priesthood, the Sons of Light, who included the first Hermes, and others who created external, physical memory banks in order to protect, even if in secret, the history of the human race and the rise and fall of civilizations, so that when the final destruction of the Atlantean islands, namely of Poseidia, occurred, these missionaries were already present in former Atlantean colonies, and could, as in Egypt, erect massive pyramids and underground complexes, which would be gradually investigated and only understood for what they truly were at precisely the right time in which the population would be ready to understand the true story of humanity and embrace the spiritual reality after such a damaging, materialistic antagonism had finally played itself out. For the sons of Belial might not be accurately described as mere atheists or skeptics, nothing so mundane at all. Rather, this sect knew full well that spiritual reality was the base reality, but for a variety of reasons, continued down the path of sexual and sinful deviance, pushing this to the utmost extreme in a manner that was quite unique, even in the known universe that Cayce describes. There are three major periods of destruction of the Atlantean landmasses. The first occurred some 50,000 years ago, when a larger continental body in the Atlantic first broke up due to a combination of natural factors and the misuses of technology, which may be described as an exotic nuclear and traditionally explosive technology. At this period, there were the first major divisions between the Sons of the Law of One and the Sons of Belial. A major point of contention between these factions had to do with the slave class of beings that existed alongside Atlantean society. These are referred to as things, and so as things they were treated, until a more humane option was being considered. These things, as we would know them, were not entirely human, but part animal in habit and appearance, and even described like organic robots. Thus, at this period, there were Atlanteans attempting to teach these beings how to reconnect with their spirit, that they were children of God no less than the ruling class, and had more to give to life than just their manual labor and thoughtless obedience. Whether or not these beings were simply a less evolved coexistent hominid, or a result of the genetic confusions stemming from the more ancient deviance of the spirit forms, forcing themselves into densified bodies through material indulgence and continuous physical action, we may never know. As Cayce explained in one place, quote, "Those entities that were then the producers, as we would term today, or the laborers, the farmers or the artisans, or those who were in the position of what we would call in the present just machines, were those that were projections of the individual activity of the group, and it was over these then that the relationships that they bore to those that were in authority that the differences arose." The second period of destruction, which Cayce equates to the biblical flood and the story of Noah, occurred between 22,000 to 28,000 BC, and was a result of the misuse of crystalline technology that is described somewhat like nuclear fusion. This technology was tuned too high for greedy purposes and resulted in the subsidence of land masses and its breaking up into islands. Although there were destructive forces of the sons of Belial, so-called, this destruction would appear to have been somewhat of an accident, however much the accident was preventable. The third period of destruction came to its peak sometime around or leading up to 10,000 BC, resulting in the submergence of Pisidia, Arion, and Og, caused apparently by similar technological misuse and natural circumstances, leading to the migrations of the survivors to Egypt, Yucatan, the Pyrenees along the modern Spanish and French border, and North America. We should also note here that while Cayce does leave room for occasional accidents happening in people's lives, he emphasizes that everything from the daily weather to the overall state of being of collective humanity is caused directly by our thoughts and actions, even those that seem physically disconnected from the world. For Cayce, there is no separation at all, but in the minds of the individuals and in the appearances. With this in mind, even natural disasters are not mere accidents, but a kind of karmic response or earth response, in conjunction with human consciousness. If we entertain this approach, we should wonder whether or not the types of consciousness existing in these Atlantean times could perhaps have even greater effect on the natural world than we are currently aware of. When asked to provide a description of the mental abilities of Atlanteans at the highest stage of Atlantean spiritual development, Cayce explains, quote, "Impossible to describe achievements physical in their spiritual development. The use of material conditions and spiritual attributes in a material world would, and do, become that as are the miracles of the sun in the material world. For even as with him, and as he walked, whether in Galilee, in Egypt, in India, in France, in England, or America, there were those periods when the activities of the physical were as was what would be termed the everyday life of the sons of God in the Atlantean or Eden experience." In another reading, where a similar question is posed, Cayce once again emphasizes the indescribability of these early capacities, because although we might presently deem them to be special, unique, esoteric, perhaps only manifest in chosen or elect persons with a spiritual gift somehow set aside for them, rather for the Atlanteans at their peak development, what we term today as ESP or parapsychological abilities were as natural as breathing and eating. Then, with the passing of thousands of years and periods of mass destruction, migration, and change, these powers were pushed into dormancy due to the overall focus on earthly and physical abilities. In one reading, we find, quote, "There are few terms in the present that would indicate the state of consciousness, save that, through the concentration of the group mind of the children of the Law of One, they entered into a fourth-dimensional consciousness, or were absent from the body." Immediately preceding the later destructive periods of Atlantis, there were groups of people who foresaw the threat and migrated into previously established colonies on a permanent basis. One such migration into Egypt occurred immediately after the final destruction of Pisidia, off the coast of modern Florida and the other major islands. This migration appears to have been planned in advance, and there were early travels to and from, and there had already been established commerce between the peoples, and at least one Atlantean city in what is now the Sahara Desert, as Cayce says, quote, "In those periods when the first change had come in the position of the land, there had been an egress of peoples from the Atlantean land, and they built a city near the edge of the Sahara." Among the primary figures of these Atlantean migrants are the initial beings who came to represent some of the Egyptian gods, such as Hermes and Ra. At this time, there were rebellions in Atlantis, and there existed flying and submersible technology based on a power source that could also be used for communication and the lifting of extremely heavy objects. Cayce actually compares these vehicles to that described by Ezekiel. There was what we might call an Atlantean priesthood who made records of the world and of Atlantis, especially learning about the religion of the Law of One, and brought these records into Egypt during a period of turmoil immediately preceding the final destruction. After this period, these Atlanteans in Egypt, headed by Hermes, are said to have constructed the Great Pyramid in exactly 100 years, from 10,490 to 10,390 BC. In subterranean chambers there apparently exists, till this day, a hall of records that will vindicate this entire story. We know for a fact that the chambers in question, which Cayce mentions, do exist, but they are mostly sealed off to the public. When asked to describe what exists in this sealed hall of records, Cayce responds, quote, "A record of Atlantis from the beginning of those periods, when the spirit took form or began the encasements in that land, and the developments of the peoples throughout their sojourn, together with the record of the first destruction and the changes that took place in the land, with the record of the sojournings of the peoples and their varied activities in other lands, and a record of the meetings of all the nations or lands for the activities in the destruction of Atlantis, and the building of the Pyramid of Initiation, together with whom, what and were the opening for the records would come, that are as copies from the sunken Atlantis. For with the change, it must rise again. In position this lies, as the sun rises from the waters, as the line of the shadows or light falls between the paws of the Sphinx, that was set later as the sentinel or guard, and which may not be entered from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx's right paw until the time has been fulfilled, when the changes must be active in this sphere of man's experience. Then it lies between the Sphinx and the river." Cayce describes a subterranean enclosure that contains this hall of records, which has since been discovered to exist, though little public information has been made available about it, and there is still an effort to prevent too much curiosity about these records, not to mention the general proclivity of modern Egyptologists to refuse to be open-minded to the level of unknowns one is faced with when dealing with Cayce's readings and the ancient mysteries of Egypt. Mention Edgar Cayce around a certain school of archaeologists, and you might find yourself on the black list of heretics and Egyptomaniacs, not to be taken seriously. For even well-known researchers uncovering the mysteries of an alternative history hesitate to mention Cayce or take him seriously, despite the overwhelming accuracy of his readings on other subjects and the list of predictions that have already come true. In Egypt, the Atlanteans and Egyptians embarked on a massive religious undertaking. When we hear that Egypt built its entire society around the immortality of the soul and the afterlife, we find that these details become intensely intriguing. In Egypt, the Atlanteans built a temple of sacrifice and the temple beautiful, serving as hospitals, therapy centers, religious centers, educational branches, and initiation chambers, used generally for an immediate felt connection with the divine and to heal or correct certain of the deformities or dormancies still present among the race of so-called things. As Cayce explains, quote, "Thus, as has been indicated, there arose the needs for the temple of sacrifice, where entities, individuals, might offer themselves for the purification of their bodies, that they first might be channels through which there might come entities, souls, manifesting in the earth, with the entire activity of body, mind, and soul. It was the same intent as had been the purpose of the priest, in the choice of that individual through whom the pure race, the pure activities of a better purpose might be made manifest." The Temple of Sacrifice was a physical experience, while the Temple Beautiful was rather of the mental, in which there was the spiritualization, not idolizing but crystallizing, of activities or services to a special purpose, or specializing in preparation for given officers of activity. This massive effort of healing and religious connection caused further dissension among Atlanteans. The sons of Belial and certain of the ruling class did not want to empower these lesser beings. This appears to be one of the primary causes of Atlantean dissension through thousands of years. Quote, "In Atlantean land, during the period of disturbances between the sons of Belial and sons of the Law of one of the priests creating better conditions for the things or those used as laboring people in those periods." And, quote, "In Atlantean land, when there were those disturbances due to confusion arising between those in authority that would make for the universality of knowledge of all nature and those that held for caste or position." In Cayce's Atlantis, we find the same archetypes of dissension, class disparity, technological classification, and obfuscation that we have playing out in the modern world. Slaves are no longer the things disconnected from their spirits, but prisoners, consumers, repressed civilians, rushing around here and there for sustenance and time, while a small group of tyrants at the height of the shadow world stuff their pockets and conceal exotic or otherworldly technology from the masses. The American Empire, as seen with the information given from Cayce about Atlantis, is but stage 4 of advanced civilization on the Atlantic Ocean, where we yet again get to play out the tension between those who dedicate themselves to a higher purpose or those who merely live for themselves, gratifying appetites without a thought to the whole. Indeed, Cayce predicts that in the future there will be a breaking up of the American continent. Some portions will become the sea, and others off the coast will rise, among many more geological shifts and changes that have been predicted, including the entirety of Japan sinking in the sea. It is yet again as if we must test ourselves. Will we take the path of the fear-based belief systems and hold to an overall negative outlook on humanity, doomed to repeat the cycles of destructive history we never learn from? Or will this next empire on the Atlantic Ocean, destined to be the torchbearer of freedom and progress, actually arrive into another height of civilization, planting the seeds of a new Atlantis, a golden age where the abundance we live in is actualized, the knowledge of universal consciousness is spread far and wide for the welfare of the whole? The decision exists within us all. If you would like to support American Esoteric, please like, subscribe, and find the links below in the description. You can also become a channel member and subscribe to the Substack. Thank you, and whatever you do, just don't join the Sons of Belial.